Welcome to the Hot News Channel, where we strip away the noise to analyze today's breaking stories. It is Friday, and thank God. It's Friday, February 27, 2026.
Thank God it's Friday. Feels a little bit optimistic today.
Yeah, just a bit.
Because if you're looking at the geopolitical dashboard right now, it's less of a celebration and more of a 5-alarm fire. I really don't think I've seen the board flash this much red since probably the early 2000s.
It is intensely volatile.
No.
And I want to set the stage for everyone listening right out of the gate, because today isn't just another standard news cycle.
Not at all.
It feels like a genuine pivot point, a game changer. We are at a moment where you have to stop looking at these isolated incidents. A skirmish over here, a diplomatic meeting over there, and start seeing a synchronized escalation.
Right, a global pattern.
Exactly. We're looking at a potential kinetic war in the Middle East, a complete hard reset of the Monroe Doctrine down in Latin America, and domestic news that honestly makes the geopolitical stuff look tame.
The stakes are absolute. We have this bizarre split-screen reality right now. On one side of the screen, you have the diplomatic theater in Geneva. Everyone is in suits, shaking hands, smiling for the cameras.
The optics of peace.
Right, the optics. But on the other side, the hard data shows the U.S. military footprint expanding at a rate we haven't seen since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We are seeing the intersection of shadow intelligence wars, specifically regarding the new Epstein files, and actual shooting wars in places like Iran and Mexico.
So our mission for this deep dive is to connect those dots. We need to bridge the gap between that diplomatic theater happening in Geneva right now, the assassination of a cartel kingpin in Mexico, a very strange friendship blossoming in Venezuela, and the release of Epstein files that the Department of Justice apparently tried very hard to bury.
It's a really messy picture, I know. But if you step back and look at the hard data, the pattern is terrifyingly clear.
Let's start with the most immediate threat on the board. We are teetering on the brink of what could be a massive regional conflict in the Middle East. Right now, trilateral talks are occurring in Geneva. The peace table, if you want to call it that.
Calling it a peace table might be extremely generous given who is actually sitting at it.
Right. Let's look at the personnel, because this is where it gets weird. The U.S. delegation is being led by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. They're sitting directly across from the Iranian foreign minister, Araki.
Which is wild.
It is. Now, for the listeners who might not track all the individual players in Washington, Steve Witkoff is a real estate developer. Jared Kushner is the president's son-in-law.
To the average observer, sending a real estate developer and a family member to negotiate nuclear de-escalation with Iran might seem a bit unconventional.
Understatement of the year.
Normally you send career diplomats, State Department lifers, people who speak Farsi, people who have studied nuclear physics and treaty law for 30 years.
But this administration has never really cared for the usual playbook.
No, and unconventional puts it very lightly. It signals a massive shift in how the administration views diplomacy as a whole. This isn't about statecraft in the traditional sense anymore.
What is it about?
It's about a transaction. It's a real estate deal.
Yeah.
The underlying logic is simply, what can I give you? What can you give me? Let's sign a piece of paper. And according to the analysis by Alexander Maturance, the decision on whether the U.S. actually attacks Iran hinges entirely on these specific talks.
Just a binary outcome.
Completely binary, deal or war.
But the personnel choices are so fascinating because of their specific history. You have Witkoff and Kushner. These are the guys deeply tied to the Abraham Accords philosophy.
Which was all about economic integration.
Right, economic integration and normalization with Israel. But here they are, fast forward to 2026, negotiating the prevention of World War III with Tehran.
Precisely. And this signals something crucial. It signals that Trump actually wants a deal. He wants the big art of the deal win, not necessarily a messy war. But the friction comes from the fact that he is completely surrounded by hawks who see this entirely differently. The absurdity here is that while these business negotiations are happening in Geneva, the military reality on the ground suggests a completely different decision might have already been made.
Let's look at that military buildup, because we pulled a report from Politico this morning that is, frankly, terrifying if you read between the lines. White House officials reportedly believe that, quote-unquote, politics are better if Israel strikes Iran first.
The politics are better. That is the cynical calculation of the century right there. Let's unpack what that actually means for a second. The administration knows full well that the American public has zero appetite for a war with Iran. None.
After 20 years in the sandbox, nobody wants to go back.
Exactly. The polling is incredibly clear on that. You can't just launch a preemptive strike and sell it to the voters.
So how do you get them to support going back?
You get hit. The strategy, according to these leaks, is to essentially have Israel provoke a retaliation. If Israel strikes and Iran strikes back, which Tehran has loudly vowed to do, the hope, according to these leaks, is that the Iranians hit American assets in the crossfire.
Wait, hold on. Let's just pause on that because that is a massive, massive implication.
Yeah.
You're saying the strategy, according to the analysis of these leaks, is to essentially use American troops stationed in the region as bait.
That is the direct implication. It's a classic tripwire strategy. You leave your forces exposed in a highly volatile zone. You let your ally poke the bear. And when the bear swipes and accidentally or intentionally hits you, you suddenly have your casus belli.
Your justification for war.
Exactly. It overrides all domestic opposition instantly, because if American soldiers are hit, it's no longer Trump starting another Middle East war. It instantly becomes, we must defend our boys.
And the hardware moving into the region backs this up. We're just seeing a few ships moving around or a standard show of force. According to Colonel Douglas McGregor, and we know he rarely misses on these logistical analyses, the scale of the buildup tells a very specific tactical story. He specifically pointed out the presence of over 100 aerial refuelers.
The gas station in the sky, that's the critical metric right there.
Why does that specific number matter so much? Why 100?
Because of the physics of modern warfare. If you were doing a slap on the wrist strike, a few Tomahawk missiles, maybe a quick sortie by a couple of fighter jets, you absolutely do not need 100 tankers. Tankers are the lifeline for sustained, high-intensity bombing campaigns.
So they're preparing for a long haul.
Right. They allow jets to take off from very distant bases, fly deep into Iranian airspace, loiter, meaning they circle for hours while acquiring dynamic targets, drop their massive payloads, and then fly all the way back.
So this fundamentally suggests they aren't planning a quick hit.
No. You do not deploy that level of refueling infrastructure unless you are preparing to systematically dismantle Iran's infrastructure. We are talking about hitting the deep nuclear sites, crippling the power grid, wiping out command and control. That is a weeks-long campaign. That is a full-scale war.
And Iran clearly sees this. They aren't blind to the Armada gathering off their coast. They have satellites, too. The reporting highlights that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has essentially called the American bluff.
He has. And this is where the impact part of our analysis gets genuinely scary. Iran has officially threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Let's remind everyone listening why that specific body of water matters. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a random line on a map.
It is the absolute jugular vein of the global economy. We are talking about the narrow choke point where 20% of the world's daily oil flows through.
20%?
Yeah. If Iran mines that strait, or even just sinks one supertanker right in the middle of the shipping lane, the global economy goes into immediate cardiac arrest. Oil hits $300 a barrel overnight. Global supply chains freeze completely. It would frankly make the 2008 crash look like a minor correction.
They've also cited UN Article 51, stating clearly that if they are attacked, all aggressor bases in the region are legitimate military targets.
And that right there is the trap we talked about. Aggressor bases means U.S. bases in the UAE, in Qatar, in Bahrain. If the U.S. allows Israel to strike and Iran responds by launching a volley of ballistics at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, we are in a full-scale regional war within hours.
Is there any kind of off-ramp here? Because Professor John Mearsheimer, in a really brilliant analysis with Glenn Deason recently, pointed out something very interesting about Trump's State of the Union address. He noticed Trump focused almost exclusively on the nuclear weapons. He didn't harp on the ballistic missile programs or the regional proxy militias like he usually does.
That is the one glimmer of hope in all this data. Mearsheimer, who is, a realist's realist when it comes to geopolitics, he argues that by dropping the demands for total disarmament of Iran's conventional missiles, Trump might be offering a face-saving exit ramp. The Israel lobby, specifically AIPAC, is pushing hard for total disarmament. They want Iran stripped completely naked, defensively speaking.
But for Tehran, giving up their conventional ballistic missiles would be strategic suicide.
Exactly. It's their only real deterrent against invasion. So if Trump is essentially saying at the Geneva table, look, just give me the nukes and we're good, maybe there actually is a transactional deal to be made. But if the underlying demand remains total absolute disarmament, then war is mathematically inevitable. It's a terrifying game of chicken with nuclear stakes.
So we have this highly transactional president actively trying to close a real estate-style deal in Geneva, while his political allies and his own military buildup are screaming for a kinetic war. And while we all watch the Middle East, the other hand is incredibly busy in our own hemisphere. This hard reset of the Monroe Doctrine is moving at breakneck speed.
It's the backyard strategy. If you're preparing to go to war in the East, you absolutely need to lock down the West.
Let's pivot to Latin America then, specifically Venezuela. The situation on the ground in Caracas right now is entirely surreal. We are just weeks past January 3, 2026.
Just a few weeks.
Right. The day a U.S. military operation literally extracted Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores from the country.
Kidnapped is the word many international observers and legal scholars are using, though Washington obviously prefers to call it an apprehension. But look at the immediate aftermath. Usually when you decapitate a hostile government like that, you expect a massive power vacuum, riots in the streets, chaos, or maybe a U.S.-installed opposition leader like Maria Corina Machado finally taking the reins of power.
But that's not what happened at all. Instead, we have the U.S. Energy Secretary sitting in Caracas, shaking hands with Delcy Rodriguez, who is now the interim president.
Delcy Rodriguez, who is literally the vice president under Maduro. The regime itself hasn't changed one bit. The figurehead has just been swapped out.
And we have this incredible, highly revealing footage from Shane Smith's recent reporting. They were right there on the ground in Caracas.
That Shane Smith interview is an absolute masterclass in raw realpolitik. You have Delcy Rodriguez openly admitting on camera that sitting across from the CIA director, the very agency she directly blames for the death of her own father, is painful. She literally hates these people, viscerally. But she sits down and does the deal anyway. Why?
It always comes back to the oil.
Exactly. Venezuela produces about 900,000 barrels a day currently. The U.S. desperately wants to ramp that number up significantly. With the Middle East about to explode and the Strait of Hormuz potentially closing any day now, Washington fundamentally needs rock-solid energy security in the West.
So it's purely transactional. We took out Maduro not because he was a brutal dictator, but because he was a non-compliant dictator.
Correct. We didn't actually want to change the underlying autocratic structure of the government. We just wanted a new manager in the office who would sign the oil extraction contracts. Shane Smith made a really great point in his analysis. He called the current vibe in Caracas the Wild West. You have massive American energy companies bringing in huge capital and advanced technology to restart these decaying oil fields. And the Venezuelan elite, the very same corrupt people we strictly sanctioned for years, are welcoming them with open arms because they desperately want the cash flow.
It totally exposes the sheer hypocrisy of the freedom rhetoric we hear out of Washington. We aren't bringing democracy to Venezuela. We are bringing Chevron. The political opposition, the people who actually won the recent elections according to all the independent data, they are still sitting on the sidelines. We simply swapped a non-compliant dictator for a highly compliant interim leader.
And speaking of that extraction operation, there was a bizarre, almost sci-fi detail about the raid itself. Trump has been openly bragging at rallies about a secret new weapon used during the operation. He calls it the discombobulator.
The discombobulator. You really have to appreciate the branding, even if it sounds like something Wile E. Coyote would buy from Acme.
It does. It sounds ridiculous. But the tactical implications are deadly serious. The claim is that this device completely disabled all Venezuelan air defenses electronically, allowing the U.S. Blackhawks to enter the airspace, extract the target, and exit without taking a single round of anti-aircraft fire. Whether that's just Trumpian hyperbole or a genuine next-generation electronic warfare, sweet likely some sort of high-powered directed jamming pod that completely scrambles radar and comms, the strategic result is exactly the same. The U.S. just proved to the entire world it can reach out and touch anyone, anywhere in the hemisphere with zero friction.
Which brings us perfectly to Mexico. Because if Venezuela was a clean surgical extraction, Mexico this past week was an absolute bloodbath. We have the killing of Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, the elusive leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel.
A massive, massive geopolitical event. El Mencho was undoubtedly the most wanted man in North America. But look at the intense narrative battle that erupted immediately afterwards. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum is fiercely insisting this was a strictly sovereign Mexican operation. No outside help. She's very, very protective of that image of national sovereignty.
But the hard reporting from Katrina Schultz tells a very different story.
Schultz reports that U.S. intelligence was intimately operationally involved in the strike. You do not simply take down a hardened target like El Mencho, who lives in remote fortified mountains surrounded by a literal private army, without the kind of massive signal intelligence only the NSA and CIA possess. We're talking about real-time tracking of encrypted satellite phones, orbital heat signatures, the whole 9 yards.
But notice the diplomatic dance happening here. The U.S. is actively downplaying its own role. Why? Usually, politicians in Washington love to step up to the podium and take full credit for getting the big bad guy.
Because if they publicly take credit, they risk immediate violent retaliation against soft American targets. The CJNG isn't just a street gang, it's a heavily armed paramilitary force. If they decide to target American tourists in Puerto Vallarta or Cancun in retaliation for a U.S. strike, it's a political and economic disaster. They also strategically need to let Sheinbaum save face domestically. She cannot look like she's just a proxy puppet for U.S. intelligence.
But taking a step back, does killing a guy like El Mencho actually solve this systemic problem?
No. And this is exactly what analyst Kurt Hackbarth calls the catastrophic failure of the kingpin strategy. We've been running this exact same playbook since the days of Pablo Escobar in the 90s. You cut off the head of the snake, but in the cartel world, it's not a snake, it's a hydra.
We saw that exact same dynamic with El Chapo. The Sinaloa cartel didn't just disappear into the night, it just splintered and got infinitely more violent.
Exactly. Instead of one tightly disciplined, business-focused hierarchy, you suddenly have 10 heavily armed, warring factions fighting street by street for the exact same territory. The hard data shows that violence usually increases sharply after a kingpin is killed. And Hackbarth points out something deeply disturbing about this specific raid: the weaponry involved. These cartels are fighting back against government forces with 50 caliber machine guns.
Which are U.S.-made weapons.
Correct. They're buying them right across the border. We are literally arming the very paramilitaries we are then spending billions helping the Mexican government destroy. It's a self-perpetuating, incredibly lucrative cycle of violence that justifies huge, bloated security budgets in Washington, but never actually stops a single ounce of drugs from crossing the border.
It's the textbook definition of insanity.
Yeah.
And speaking of old Cold War habits dying hard, we have to talk about what just happened in Cuba. It honestly feels like we're stuck in a time machine this week. We have verified reports of a deadly firefight off the coast of Villa Clara.
This is a fascinating, highly dangerous incident that is mostly flying under the mainstream radar right now. According to the detailed reporting from Reason to Resist and the analysis by Arnold August, a Florida-registered speedboat with 10 people on board actively engaged the Cuban Coast Guard in a firefight.
And to be clear, this wasn't a recreational fishing trip gone wrong.
Yeah.
They were found with heavy tactical gear, military camouflage uniforms, and the raw materials to make Molotov cocktails. And they were intercepted just 1 nautical kilometer off the Cuban coast.
That is deep inside sovereign territorial waters. The Cuban authorities obviously returned fire, killing 4 of the attackers and capturing the remaining 6. Havana has officially labeled them terrorist infiltrators launching from the United States.
And what's the U.S. response to this? Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who we all know has a very specific hardline personal stance on Cuba, he flatly refused to confirm or deny U.S. involvement. He just deflected, saying he needs independent data before commenting.
Which, in Washington speak, is code for, I'm not going to talk about this because the details are messy, but let's connect this to the Bay of Piglets, that botched Operation Gideon in Venezuela a few years back. There is a very clear, undeniable pattern here of U.S.-tolerated, or perhaps actively U.S.-encouraged, right-wing exile operations launching from American soil.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson made a really sharp point about the logistics of this. He pointed out that the U.S. Coast Guard is incredibly well-funded and highly efficient in those specific Florida waters. The idea that a heavily laden speedboat loaded with obvious tactical gear and militants just casually left a marina in Florida and made it all the way to Cuba without U.S. authorities noticing is, well, it's highly unlikely.
It completely strains credulity. Either the Coast Guard is suddenly totally incompetent, which is highly doubtful given their track record, or someone higher up ordered them to turn a blind eye. It strongly suggests that while the official U.S. military is handling the big public operations like grabbing Maduro, there is this murky gray zone where deniable paramilitary groups are being allowed to constantly probe enemy defenses.
And the irony here is just incredibly thick. Secretary Rubio constantly demands freedom and the rule of law for Cuba, while ostensibly allowing armed paramilitaries to launch lethal attacks from U.S. soil. It's a flagrant violation of international law, plain and simple.
And strategically, it completely backfires. It solidifies the regime's narrative in Havana. The Cubans point to this as absolute proof that the U.S. is still trying to violently overthrow their sovereign government. It totally justifies their internal crackdowns on dissidents. It's essentially a massive political gift to the hardliners in the Communist Party.
So we have the Middle East literally on fire, Latin America in a state of forced, violent transition, and now let's bring it back home. Let's turn to the domestic bombshell that dropped this week, the Epstein files.
This is the story that simply refuses to die, and for very, very good reason. The Department of Justice has finally released a massive cache of documents, 3 million files.
3 million sounds like a lot until you hear the next statistic. Because, and this is a huge caveat, those 3 million files represent only 2% of the total data seized from its properties.
2%. I want everyone listening to just imagine that for a second. Imagine if you were being thoroughly investigated for a massive, multi-state organized crime ring, and the FBI only looked at 2% of the hard evidence they collected, and then publicly said, all right, wrap it up. Nothing left to see here.
And what's missing from that 2% is even more telling than what's actually in there. We have incredible reporting from Tara Palmieri and others tracking this, showing that 90 specific FBI interview records are entirely missing from the database. Poof. Gone. And specifically, these include follow-up interviews with a woman who made a very specific documented allegation against Donald Trump.
Now, we have to be extremely precise here. We are analyzing the data, not taking a political side on the allegation itself. We don't know if the core allegation is true or false. That's not the point. What we are definitively saying is that the official government record of the investigation into a sitting president has conveniently vanished from the archives. That is an obstruction of historical fact, if not outright obstruction of justice.
But it's not just about protecting Trump, though. The rot goes way deeper. The Epstein class, as we'll call them, seems to cross all political party lines effortlessly. But the most explosive revelation buried in these newly released files is the direct intelligence connection.
This is the massive impact angle that the mainstream corporate media almost always deliberately ignores. We have a confidential human source, a CHS, which in MPI terminology means a vetted, highly reliable informant who explicitly, formally claims in these documents that Jeffrey Epstein was an active Mossad agent.
Let's look at the specific details of that claim. The CHS describes a private conversation where the prominent lawyer Alan Dershowitz allegedly told Alex Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney in Miami handling the initial slap-on-the-wrist plea deal, that Epstein, quote-unquote, belonged to intelligence.
It belonged to intelligence. That single phrase explains absolutely everything. It explains the unprecedented non-prosecution agreement. It explains the extreme leniency. It explains why local cops were told to back off. If he was a protected intelligence asset, a completely distinct, classified set of rules applied to him.
The files also specifically mention Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, visiting Epstein's properties frequently. And the deep investigative reporting from the Young Turks highlights that Epstein's massive blackmail operation wasn't just for his own sick personal satisfaction or deviance.
Right. The working theory, completely backed up by the pattern in these new files, is that it was a sophisticated honey trap operation running on an industrial, state-sponsored scale. The ultimate goal was to aggressively gather dirt compromat on powerful American politicians, leading scientists, and Wall Street billionaires to permanently influence U.S. policy.
Specifically to benefit Israel. The CHS essentially claims Epstein was gathering this devastating information to ensure American foreign and economic policy perfectly aligned with Israeli state interests behind closed doors.
And this brings us crashing right back to the current geopolitical situation we discussed earlier. If dozens of powerful U.S. politicians are compromised, if there are high-definition tapes or detailed financial files that Epstein carefully created and hid away, it forces every citizen to ask a horrifying question. How much of our current foreign policy, especially regarding Iran and the Middle East, is actually being driven by unseen blackmail?
There's also a truly chilling anecdote buried in the files about the night Epstein died in his cell. We all remember hearing Attorney General Bill Barr forcefully say there was absolutely no one in the secure area that night. The cameras malfunctioned, the guards slept, end of story. But these files explicitly mention a, quote, orange figure seen walking in the restricted jail area during that time frame.
It contradicts the official Department of Justice narrative entirely, completely shatters it, and it just fuels the widespread, totally justified skepticism. If the top law enforcement officials in the country lied directly to the public about who was physically present in the jail that night, what else are they systematically lying about regarding the network?
And the network wasn't just politicians, though. This is where it gets incredibly bizarre. The files reveal deep structural connections to the elite scientific community. Let's look at the Santa Fe Institute. Originally, they publicly claimed they only received about $275,000 in donations from Epstein. The newly unsealed financial files show it was actually well over $680,000.
This is the deliberate laundering of his public reputation. You had people like Murray Gell-Mann, a literal Nobel Prize-winning physicist, actively writing warm letters to Epstein, wishing him well right after he got out of his first prison stint for soliciting minors. Epstein intentionally bought these high-level academic relationships. He aggressively compartmentalized his life. He used the brilliant scientist to give him a shiny veneer of elite respectability in polite society, while he simultaneously ran a massive intelligence gathering operation for a foreign state in the shadows.
It's terrifying to think about the sheer breadth of this web. It literally touched the White House, the Ivy League, the top tier of the scientific elite, and the deepest levels of the intelligence agencies.
And that is exactly why the document release is so heavily fragmented and redacted. The Epstein class is actively protecting itself in real time. They are releasing just enough files, 2%, to be able to go on TV and say they complied with transparency laws, but they are desperately holding back the actual smoking guns that would implicate the power structure itself.
So we've covered the brink of war in the Middle East, the shadow spies, and the cartel violence. Now let's talk about the underlying engine that actually drives all of this chaos. The economy, because there is a massive structural reset happening right now at the Federal Reserve that no one is paying enough attention to.
This might honestly be the most consequential story of the entire decade for the average person. President Trump has formally appointed Kevin Warsh to replace Jerome Powell as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Powell's term officially expires on May 15, 2026.
Now, Kevin Warsh. For those who follow monetary policy, he's known as a strict hawk on the balance sheet, right? He was the guy loudly arguing against quantitative easing and easy money back in the day. But Trump famously loves low interest rates. He wants the money printer to go brrr to juice the markets. So how do you possibly square a known fiscal hawk with a president who demands cheap money?
That is the billion-dollar question right now. And financial analyst Tom Bilyeu has put forward a theory that is, well, it's revolutionary. He calls it the shadow plan.
Break that shadow plan down for us.
The theory is that Warsh and Trump aren't going to just tweak interest rates. They are planning to fundamentally revalue the U.S. Treasury's gold reserves.
Okay, let's look at the hard data on this. The U.S. officially holds about 261 million ounces of gold in reserves. On the official books right now, it's valued at a statutory rate of exactly $42.22 an ounce. That's a bizarre accounting relic from the 1970s.
Right. But the actual global market price today is over $3,300 an ounce. If the Fed simply updates the internal accounting, just literally revalues that physical gold to current market rates, it instantly, magically, creates about $800 billion in brand new equity on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet.
Without having to physically print a single new fiat dollar.
Exactly. It expands the balance sheet tremendously without causing immediate consumer inflation, theoretically. It allows the administration to point to the vault and say, look, the U.S. dollar is fully backed by this massive, tangible, appreciating asset. It psychologically restores market confidence. It's a very clever way to have your cake and eat it too. You drastically expand available credit without technically printing unbacked fiat currency.
And then there's the wild card, the Bitcoin angle. The administration is currently holding massive amounts of seized Bitcoin from various law enforcement operations. And crucially, they aren't auctioning it off like previous administrations did.
This represents a tectonic shift away from the pure fiat standard we've been on since Richard Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. By intentionally holding Bitcoin in reserve, and simultaneously preparing to revalue gold, they're loudly signaling a move toward an asset-backed currency model. It's an elite hedge against the inevitable collapse of the U.S. dollar's global dominance. They see the BRICS nations moving away from the dollar, and they are trying to build a lifeboat.
But the real-world economy isn't all just theoretical gold bars and digital Bitcoin reserves. There's a massive disconnect happening on Main Street. And honestly, I love the metaphor of the Trump watch to explain this.
The Trump watch. It's absolutely the perfect, shiny symbol for the current macroeconomic moment we're living in.
So Trump recently sold these branded watches for $100,000 a pop, promising his supporters they were a highly valuable piece of history, an investment with inherent Trumpian value. Today, if you check the secondary market, they are trading for around $5,000.
That is a staggering 95% loss in value almost overnight. It perfectly illustrates the dangerous difference between perceived value, the marketing hype, the brand loyalty, the empty political promises, and actual market value, which is what a rational actor is actually willing to pay for the underlying asset.
And isn't that the exact danger with the whole U.S. economy right now? We are artificially propping up the stock market. We are talking about revaluing gold reserves on paper. We are hyping up a massive manufacturing recovery. But is the underlying asset, the actual productive American economy, actually worth what the politicians say it is?
That's the ultimate fear keeping economists awake at night. If the Trump watch economy finally collapses, it won't just be a few wealthy collectors losing their disposable income. It will be everyone's retirement accounts, everyone's savings. The illusion will shatter.
We have covered a truly staggering amount of ground today. From the aerial refuelers circling over the Persian Gulf to the armed speedboats getting intercepted off Cuba, the missing FBI files in Washington, and the quiet boardrooms of the Federal Reserve.
It's a lot to process. But when you step back and look at the whole board, there is a very clear, undeniable thread connecting all of these seemingly disparate stories.
Sovereignty versus control. That's the fundamental theme I'm seeing everywhere. Whether it's the U.S. claiming extraterritorial jurisdiction over Mexican cartels, claiming the right to dictate who extracts Venezuelan oil, or demanding total control over Iranian nuclear physics. We are watching the aggressive, rapid erosion of national boundaries.
And simultaneously, the erosion of our own domestic sovereignty. Because if Jeffrey Epstein was indeed compromising top-tier U.S. politicians for a foreign intelligence service, then the most critical decisions in Washington aren't actually being made for the benefit of everyday Americans. They are being made specifically to satisfy the blackmailers holding the tapes.
And the hidden truth here, the harsh reality that the mainstream networks completely miss, is that the impending kinetic war in the Middle East and the forced transactional peace in Venezuela are quite literally two sides of the exact same coin.
Absolutely. The U.S. is ruthlessly securing energy resources, heavy crude oil in the West, specifically so they have the logistical capacity to expend them in a massive conflict in the East. We are forcing compliance to fill the gas tank in Caracas today so we can empty it fighting a war in Tehran tomorrow. It is a massive, coordinated, global resource reallocation program solely for the purpose of sustaining a war machine.
That is a profoundly sobering thought to end on. But as we've seen today, it's the hard reality we all need to face.
Ignorance is definitely not bliss in 2026. It's incredibly dangerous. You have to look at the data.
If you found this deep analysis valuable, if you want the hard data that the other channels miss or gloss over, hit the plus or follow button on your podcast app and give us a like. It really helps us keep the lights on and keep the truth coming.
Subscribe to the Hot News channel for more deep dives. We strip the noise so you can see the signal. Until we meet again, goodbye.